Okay, we're going to go ahead and go through environmental, see how we are on time, and then we might either break for lunch or move on to right away. I'll kind of leave it up to you guys, but let's start chapter 5, the environmental chapter. So Jessica mentioned in project development that there are 5 required certifications for every project. Environmental is the first of those. And the reason that we put environmental first is because often it can take a long time to get an environmental cert, depending on the scope of your project. We also recommend that you start it first because you will need an environmental cert before you can obtain a right-of-way certification. Okay, so start your environmental as early as possible. Okay, some general requirements and considerations. There are 3 basic elements to the environmental certification. There's the NEPA documentation, the National Environmental Policy Act. So this covers your project purpose and need. This covers if you have to do public outreach. All of these things are documented under NEPA. There is also the cultural resources part of the environmental cert. So this is coordinating with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, or in the tribal entities, THPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And then there is the hazardous materials portion. Okay, so hazardous materials, there's basically 3 conditions that if your project does not have any of those 3, you can just do a simple ISA determination letter and submit that, and that takes care of hazardous materials. If you are going to be purchasing property, disturbing soil more than 2 feet, or impacting structures. Those are the 3 triggers that would require higher levels of hazardous materials investigations. Okay, so all that information for hazardous materials specifically is on page 74 in your handbook. The region coordinator is your point of contact. They will assist you through the environmental process. They will work with our environmental bureau at NMDOT to submit all of your documentation that's required, and then to issue you a certification. Okay, so just keep in mind that your point of contact is still the region coordinator. You can hire consultants to help you with the environmental process. Okay, so if you have staff in-house that can handle those things, that's okay. But if you have a consultant on board, everything under environmental is a reimbursable expense, as long as you had it in your scope of services, in your RFP. Okay. The first thing that you need to do to start your environmental certification is an environmental level of effort form. And we're going to skip off the slide and jump over to our website and show you what that form looks like. Okay, so it's under the environmental chapter. Okay, so this is the environmental level of effort form. A lot of the information that goes on this form is found either in your scoping report or on your project prospectus form. So you probably already have all the information that you need to fill out this form. Don't reinvent the wheel. Okay, use the information that you already have to fill this out. Number 12 is really important. I'm going to read it to you. Do not conduct or contract for biological and cultural resource surveys until receiving a reply from NMDOT Environmental Bureau. Okay, so our Environmental Bureau will let you know if you need cultural resource surveys or biological resource surveys. Okay, so don't just go out and do those thinking that that's part of the environmental documentation. It may not be required. If you are doing a project on downtown Main Street and it happens to be a historic district and there's a lot of historic buildings, you might be required to do a cultural resource survey. But again, wait until you hear from our Environmental Bureau on that. I like to tell people at this point to add a little bit of contingency into your design services cost estimate, because sometimes things come up that you would not expect through environmental. And the story that I like to tell for this is I was involved in a project in an unnamed district with an unnamed TLPA. They wanted to build a path through a park that they owned. There happened to be a dead tree in this park, right where they wanted to build the path. They decided, we're going to cut that dead tree down, no big deal, just remove it. Well, guess what? There was a bird in that dead tree. That bird had a nest, and that nest happened to have eggs of endangered species in there. So they were not able to cut down that dead tree in their park until all of those baby birds flew away and someone was able to remove that nest. So again, that's an extreme case, but those are some of the things that could come up in your project. So I say leave a little bit of contingency for some of those things potentially coming up as you're going through environmental documentation. Okay. Number 13, the initial site investigation. So this is the hazardous materials part of the certification. Audrey Moore at our environmental geology division is the one who issues the letters, the approvals for the hazardous materials section. Brian Cribben in our environmental department will not issue you a certification until he hears from Audrey that your site is not going to have hazardous material impacts. Okay, so we have an ISA determination letter. Like I said, there's the 3 triggers listed on page 74. If your project does not have any of those things on it, then this letter can be filled out by either you, the TLPA, or your consultants, and submitted to Audrey. You have to fill in the information here about your project. She'll look at it, make sure that there's no additional requirements for hazardous materials, and she'll sign it and send it to Brian so that he can issue you an environmental certification. Okay, so for most of the projects that we see, we don't have to worry about a lot of those things. The one thing is purchasing property, so if you do have right-of-way, you're going to need a little bit more coordination from environmental geology. Again, the region coordinator is your point of contact, and they will help you through the process in getting all this coordination on the back end together. Okay. Okay, remember I told you in the beginning that we're going to have lots of slides about roles and responsibilities? Okay, so here it is again. So the roles and responsibilities of the TLPA are to prepare all of the documentation required for an environmental certification. Brian will let you know what that documentation is. So it might just be a categorical exclusion checklist. It might be you need to have a cultural resource survey in your documentation, so he will let you know what it is that you need. If you are in an area where there is a high number of Spanish-speaking or other than English-speaking populations, then you might need to have additional public outreach meetings to make sure that everybody is informed about the project and has an opportunity to comment on it. Brian might let you know that some of those things are necessary. So all of that documentation is required by you all, okay? It's your responsibility to make sure that all of that happens. Our environmental bureau will work with the region coordinator to review and approve all of that documentation. Okay, so you will submit it to the region coordinator, whatever list of documents it is, and then they will submit it to Brian. He will review it and send comments back. If there are no comments, then he'll issue you an environmental certification. Most of the projects that we see are cleared at very low levels. So we're talking about categorical exclusions or programmatic categorical exclusions. We very rarely ever see environmental impact statements or environmental assessments. I mean, that's like, super big projects, probably not in this area. So most of your projects will be cleared at those 2 lowest levels. If you were looking through the handbook and you saw the environmental chapter, the old handbook, it was like 30 pages, and it got really into the weeds about all of the documents. In order to kind of clarify things and streamline it, our environmental section got it down to about 6 pages. So we don't talk about environmental impact statements. We don't talk about environmental assessments. If you should need those, then we will help you at that point in time. Okay, so we only talk about the documentation that we see on most projects in this chapter. Okay. So the certification is required on every project. Most of the time it's going to be a low level. The other thing that is your responsibility as the TLPA is to ensure that everything that is listed on the environmental certification as a commitment is followed through on. Okay, so if, let's use that bird nest example. So a certification from our environmental bureau for that might say, yes, here's your certification, but the contractor is not allowed to tear down this tree or build from June to October due to nesting season. So that might be a commitment that's listed on your environmental certification. Okay, those commitments need to be incorporated into your plan set. And so during our design review meetings, the 30, 60, 90, and PSNE, the region coordinator and our CLEs will be checking to make sure that those things are in your plan sets. Okay. Through construction, we'll also be monitoring this in the field reviews. So if you have an environmental commitment that says your contractor is not allowed to build between June and October, and we go out there and it's September and that contractor is building, you're going to be in some serious trouble, okay? So it is your job as the TLPA to ensure that whatever commitments were made on that environmental documentation are being followed by the contractors. Okay.
Is your tribal representative also brought up the issue about having to work with BIA on our environment?
Yes, so the question was, did our tribal liaison at these handbook meetings bring up the point that the tribal entities have to work with the BIA on the environmental process? Yes, he did. Again, I mean, I think this is an area where we're probably lacking in the handbook about the specific requirements. He did mention that there's a whole other process with BIA, and so we didn't write all of those specifics into there.
It basically means that tribes are exempt from providing environmental certification.
Sort of. So the comment was tribes are exempt from providing the environmental certification. That's not actually true. So you still have to provide an environmental certification at PSNE. The documentation that's required to obtain that is different though. So yeah, you might not have all of the same components that the other entities do, but you'll still have to submit some form of documentation to your region coordinator to receive a clearance. Okay, we went through that pretty quick. Are there any questions on the environmental process at this point? Okay, so take some time, work with your neighbors, and answer the questions on the environmental worksheet, and then we'll answer questions afterwards. Okay, were there any questions that came up on the environmental worksheet? No? Really? You guys are like the smartest group I've had so far, because there's been at least one question come up at most of the other trainings. It's the second to last question on the second page. Are there any structures older than 45 years within or near the project site? Why do you think we chose 45 years for that question? Because that's below the cutoff for, yep. For what?
To be considered eligible for historic.
Yep, so for historic structures, that's the cutoff, is 50 years. So we kind of tried to trick you there with, if it's 45, it's not technically historic. If it's 50, it might be with documentation. One thing to keep in mind there is not only buildings are historic, there are historic ditches and drainage structures and everything else that you can imagine can be historic. So keep that in mind.
If it's 50 years and older, does it make it historic and it's documented as historic?
So the question is, just because it's 50 years and older, does it automatically make it historic? The answer to that is no. It has to be documented by the State Historic Preservation Office that it is historic. Yeah. So that's a trick question. Okay. Okay. One more. Who is your point of contact with NMDOT at this stage in the process? Region coordinator. Do you see a theme here? I'm going to ask you every chapter. I promise it's going to change. Okay, so I'm going to leave this decision up to you all. Do you want to go through the right-of-way chapter now, or do you want to break for lunch?
I'd like to break for that.
Lunch? Okay. I think we have some nods, some shaking heads, so let's go ahead and take an hour for lunch. We'll come back and jump into the right-of-way chapter, okay?